What's up, guys? This is Nick from Arch City Poker, and today's Poker 101 series, we're going to continue with the topic covering how to play big pocket pairs, specifically pocket aces through pocket jacks. So, when entering the pot first, you always want to enter with a raise. These pairs are very strong. You want to start building the pot pre-flop. These pairs play much better in heads-up pots, in pots with low SPR, so you'd like to thin out the field. Start building the pot pre-flop as often as possible. Facing a raise when you are in position with pocket aces or pocket kings specifically, you pretty much almost always want to 3-bet. You don't want to overthink it with these big pairs. They have too much value to just flat pre-flop. Again, you want pots to be heads up with low SPRs. The only time I would consider flatting is if there are really weak players in the blinds, and you can often make more money off of them by keeping them in the pot. If there is a very, very aggro player in the blinds and he's very squeeze happy and he's willing to put the 3-bet in for you, then you can back raise with a 4-bet and get even more of your stack in pre-flop that way. The last scenario, and there might be a couple more, but these are the three I thought of right away. If the pre-flop raiser is a maniac and he is super barrel happy, then there might be more value in flatting these pairs and getting more money off of him post-flop. Facing a raise in position with pocket queens or pocket jacks specifically, I think in live full ring games, in my experience, it really depends on what position the preflop raiser is raising from and how his range is constructed. Queens and jacks can do much better as part of a very strong flatting range if your preflop raiser is only continuing against 3-bets with better hands, such as queens and ace-king. If that's the case, we shouldn't really ever be 3-betting queens and jacks, because then we're only folding out all the hands we dominate, such as pocket tens and jack 10 suited, stuff like that. So if the preflop raiser does in fact continue with worse or a wider range against 3-bets, then you definitely want to consider 3-betting these two pairs way more often than not. You again want the pot heads up. It makes your hand easier to play. You want lower SPRs. So moving on to the next slide. When facing a raise from middle position or late position, when you are in position of the preflop raiser, you definitely want to 3-bet more often than not, but you can mix in some flats to balance your range. Obviously, middle position and late position opens tend to be wider and weaker, and you want to, again, I want to keep reiterating, you want to keep getting the pot as often as you can heads up with low SPRs. This maximizes our EV. It also makes the playability of our hand much better. It makes your hand easier to play, essentially. The reason that I say you want to mix in some queens and jacks into your flatting range sometimes, I think, and more so jacks than queens. I really think you guys flat queens way too often. You probably should really 3-bet queens as much as you can. You can still mix in some flats, as I said, but specifically with these two pairs, you don't want to be so capped on certain board textures. If you are only 3-betting all the hands at the very top of your range, and your opponents are going to know then that your flatting range isn't super strong, and you want to mix in some hands that are more near the top of your range into your flatting range, simply for balance, simply so that your opponents can't range you easily if they are thinking opponents. So those are definitely some things to consider when you are considering a 3-bet or a flat with queens and jacks in position. Facing a raise from out of position with all these pocket pairs. Again, do not overthink pocket aces and pocket kings. You pretty much always want to 3-bet these unless you have a very specific reason not to. With queens and jacks again, just keep in mind the preflop raiser's position in his range. If you know this opponent at all and he's only going to continue with better, then you probably want to consider flatting. But if this opponent will continue with worse, then you definitely want to consider 3-betting. You would like, again, to get the pot heads up. You would really like to win the money pre-flop if you can, but if you're called, then you have a lot of playability and a lot of strength with your hand. And that brings me to the last point on this slide, is that let's say you have a pre-flop raiser that tends to overfold to 3-bets, or he does, in fact, continue with a lot of worse combos, especially, and he might do this more often because he is, in fact, in position and feels more comfortable. However, if he has a bunch of cold callers in position on him and it's in between you guys, consider squeezing more often, because the preflop raiser will have to worry about the players left behind him to act still. If you get the squeeze, if the 3-bet works and you get him to fold, you often get the other cold callers to fold. You pick up all that extra dead money, which makes this play much more profitable. If you are in fact called, like I said, you have a lot of hand strength and a lot of playability. You'll have a bloated pot, a low SPR, so you'll probably be able to understand if you need to commit much more easily in that situation. Continuing with these pairs post-flop, this could be a pretty general strategy, but stuff that you want to consider, as always with any combination of hand in your range, is who has the range advantage. What is the stack to pot ratio? Is there a lot of money left behind, or are stacks quite shallow? That should really determine how you want to play your hand. If your hand is worth trying to go for 3 streets of value, or is it simply just worth 1 to 2 streets of value? Do not be afraid to go for stacks with overpairs and low SPR pots, especially on board textures that you either have the range advantage on or they're kind of dry and disconnected. Board textures that simply aren't very connected, to where your opponents are only going to often have 2 pair plus when they get it in with you. Do not be afraid to go for stacks with these overpairs, because your opponents will call it off much more often than not with hands like top pair that you're dominating. They just will think you're bluffing for some reason. There's a lot of value in really playing these overpairs quite fast. Now, on the flip side, like I said, if there's a very connected flop texture, if there's a high SPR, I see too many players getting married to hands like pocket aces and pocket kings. They just simply can't fold them. They can't believe that their aces or kings got cracked again. Guys, these hands are going to lose sometimes, and you don't want to just gift your opponent money when they're clearly letting you know that they have 2 pair plus. So be very mindful of the board texture. Really think to yourself, is my opponent really trying to get me to fold an overpair in this spot, or is he really capable of bluffing in this spot? So that's something to definitely consider. Otherwise, like I said, do not be afraid to go for stacks with these overpairs, especially when the SPRs are lower. Like if they're 6 or lower, you can often very profitably just get it in. In general, I think this is a very important point. This is a point that I make to all my students and a lot of players, especially in full ring live low stakes games. Just in general, bet fold these overpairs post flop, as most opponents will not have a high enough bluffing frequency on the turn and or river. You will be able to play perfectly against their strategy, which is often just call with worse and just raise with better. And there's no sense in trying to pot control on, what are sometimes scary turns or semi-scary turns. If you think it's close, if you think your opponent can often call with pair plus draw types of hands, or, he could definitely have some 2 pair plus, but there's still a lot of combos, a lot of draws that he will call with on the turn, then just bet. And if your opponent raises and it's the type of opponent that you don't think can bluff at a high enough frequency, then you can pretty comfortably fold, and that's how you exploit them. So for discussion, and this is something a little new I'm doing with these new PowerPoint slides, at least this is new for this specific video, I did not mention facing 4-bets when you have 3-bet on purpose. I want you guys to go ahead and think about if this situation occurs. Consider how it makes sense to continue against certain ranges. For example, if you 3-bet queens and your opponent 4-bets from out of position, what does his range look like? How should you continue, and should you continue at all? Let me know in the comment section if you guys have some answers or aren't quite sure. I think to become the best player you can be, you have to be able to think for yourselves and try to construct ranges and think about, what strategies will work against your opponent's strategies and counters and such. So I do think that I would like for you guys that watch these videos to think a little bit for yourselves. And if you want to answer and talk about the 4-bet scenarios a little bit more, then don't be afraid to let me know, and feel free to just fire away in the comment section. So thanks for watching. As always, like I said, let me know in the comment section if you guys have anything you want to add, especially about if you face a 4-bet scenario. Until next time, this is Nick from Arch City Poker. Take care.